All right. Hello. Hi, Colton. How are you?
Hey, Damian, I'm doing well. How about you?
Doing well, doing well. Thanks for joining today. We're going to be talking about brown spot today. It's a really cool topic. I've heard quite a few things in the last couple months, couple of years about this specific disease, uh, you know, popping up in different states, different areas in the southeastern United States. So I just wanted to have a conversation with you. I know you're working in a few projects related to brown spot, so maybe we can, clear up some of those questions and see how that goes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very important topic here in the Southeast, so I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Awesome. So first of all, just to start, where are you located? What lab are you part of in the United States?
So, I'm a research professional in Dr. Katerina Villery's forest pathology lab, and I'm in the Warnell School of Forestry at the University of Georgia. So, here we work mostly with diseases that affect pines. That's, most of the forest commodity here in the Southeast is pines, but we also deal some in hardwood diseases as well.
Awesome. So how long have you been working in pathology, or how do you actually got interested in the topic?
So I took sort of a zigzag path into forest pathology. My undergraduate degree was in microbiology, and I worked mostly with bacteria. I dabbled a bit in potato disease during that
Mm-hmm.
time, and then I worked for Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, dealing with a lot of hardwood diseases up north, a lot of oak wilt, and then heterobasidion on pines. Then I took a little time to work in human public health, where I was exposed to some of the emerging technologies and genomics that are used to help diagnose and understand human diseases. But I really loved forest health more than anything, so I came back to it. But I brought a lot of those skills in genetics and genomics with me back into forest health. And since coming back to this field, I've been at the University of Georgia.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So just to start a little bit with brown spot, first question: what is actually brown spot, and why is it important? Why is it a thing?
So, brown spot needle blight is a native disease of pines, and we usually see it most of all here in the southeast United States. So, I say it's native. As far as we know, it's always been here on the landscape, and it's always been an issue that affects, say, longleaf pine. The causal agent is the fungus Lecanosticta acicula, um, and it's an issue on longleaf pine, and also we tend to see it pop up on Scots pine farms, Christmas tree farms, here and a little bit further north.
Yeah, I was
So,
gonna ask you about that because I've seen it mostly in longleaf pine. That's kind of like the traditional where brown spot is typically an issue. But in the last couple of years, it kind of like showed up in different species as well, right? So this is not something that
right.
is specific to longleaf pine.
No, not at all. And so traditionally we understand it as a longleaf pathogen. And we see it a lot in the grass stage of longleaf pine when these trees first germinate, they stick pretty close to the ground.
Mm.
We call it the grass stage because the seedlings resemble bunches of grass, right? And it's been an issue for regeneration of longleaf pine for as long as people have been trying to regenerate pine in the region. But we see it on other hosts, especially in the past 10 or so years. It's been a problem on loblolly pine. So,
Mm.
loblolly is the primary timber commodity here in the Southeast. There's millions upon millions of acres grown from Texas up into Virginia in planted forest settings. So, these are monocultures. We're growing a whole bunch of lob in rows for timber and other forest products, right? So, that's a lot of pine all in one spot. Well, we know from Lecanosticta acicula's activity abroad, where it's invasive, that it will attack other pines, especially when those pines are kind of out of their element or stressed. And now all of a sudden we're seeing this aggressive behavior that we see on these non-co-evolved hosts here on our loblolly pine.
So in what areas has this pathogen has been introduced besides the United States? You mentioned it was native, but where it has been introduced?
So it's considered invasive in Europe primarily, and we see it in quite a few spaces throughout Europe and southern Europe, but also up into, I think Poland was one of the most recent detections.
Mm.
And then it's also considered invasive in South America, where we'll see damage caused by, or damage in some of the timber plantations or timber forests in South America as well.
So within the U.S., you mentioned that in the last couple of years it's become kind of like quite a big issue, not only in longleaf but also in loblolly pine. Is there any particular state that this disease has been more like a problem, or it's kind of like widespread across the southeastern United States?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We are seeing needle diseases increase in their scale, in the severity, and the frequency. Outbreaks of these diseases all throughout the southeast United States. So we're
Mm.
seeing outbreaks in Texas, we're seeing them in Alabama, Georgia. But when we're talking about brown spot needle blight specifically, we're seeing a lot of those outbreaks concentrated in Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and parts of Louisiana as well.
Is that basically because of local conditions, or there's something else going on in terms of climate or management or something like that?
Those are all big questions that we just don't know the answers to yet. And those are, I mean, the growers have been asking that, us at the universities have been
Mm.
asking that. And really, since these issues are so new, at least with respect to loblolly pine, we
Yeah.
simply haven't had the time to establish research sites and really dig into what climactic factors or stand factors, management practices may or may not be impacting disease severity.
Yeah, kind of like what are the triggers? That's actually a cool thing to look into for sure. So this is something that has been going on for a while here. It's native, so I imagine that we have a very good idea of what the symptoms, the signs of these pathogen are. Can you talk a little bit about that? How do recognize the disease out in the field?
Definitely, yeah. So recognizing the disease as a needle disease can be kind of tricky, and that was one of the major barriers to initially recognizing the scale of the damage that we were seeing. Is
Mm.
you look at a stand or even some of these trees that are affected, and you see a bunch of brown needles, and that it could be the same as pretty much anything else.
Yeah.
But the key to recognizing a foliar disease or a needle disease on pine is when we're looking at the crown, you'll tend to see the needles browning up, dying, sometimes falling off, but that starts towards the bottom of the crown, closer to the
Okay.
ground, closer to where maybe these spores are accumulating in the environment. It's also a little more humid at the bottom of the crown. Those conditions are a little more favorable to the fungus developing. So the bottom of the crown will brown up and start to go first, and that death will kind of march up through the crown. And then also, the older needles tend to brown up and drop off before newer ones. And so we get this kind of bottle brush effect, as we call it, where all the older needles are gone and you just have a little tuft of new growth at the end. Of course,
Mm.
that might be brown too by the time you see the tree. Now, that's if you're sort of zoomed out, but if you kind of get your hands on some of these needles and you're looking at them up close, on the needles themselves, if you catch the symptoms early enough, you'll see yellow spots, or sometimes we call them bands, where little sections of needles will be yellow and discolored. Sometimes the whole needle overall might be kind of yellowish, but we get these distinct yellow spots. And with time, or if you pick samples a little bit later in the season, you'll see little distinct dead spots inside of those yellow areas. And that's the brown spot, the namesake of the disease. And then with more time yet, those spots grow, they'll coalesce, they'll grow together, and they'll kind of cut off the needle from wherever it's dead to the tip. So we get dead tips on the needles. Eventually, that whole needle's going to die. And then it'll drop off after some time, or you might see it dead attached to the tree.
So basically, important thing here is to look at individual needles and see if we see those kind of like spots, kind of like girdling that needle from that
Yes.
uh, particular point onward, basically. And
Yes.
is that something that happens the same way for all hosts? So if you look like longleaf pine, if you look at loblolly, we expect to see the same pattern, or there are some difference between them?
Functionally, those symptoms are going to look very similar. And this
Gotcha.
is another point I wanted to get to is brown spot needle blight isn't the only needle disease that affects loblolly pine, right? There are some other, we usually term them needle casts of
Mm-hmm.
loblolly pine. Now, it seems like they're in two different camps in terms of the scale of damage they cause. But if you're getting to the tree and you're seeing the symptom presentation, those symptoms look pretty much identical. You'll see the spots, you'll see bands, sometimes you'll see this whole needle death. Now, with brown spot, we tend to see dispersed dead spots throughout the needles, maybe more often than we would in cases of needle cast, some of these other needle diseases. But if you're looking to get a confirmation for brown spot or really know what's going wrong, if you're seeing anything go wrong with those needles, it's a good idea to collect samples and send them to a lab that will be able to
Gotcha.
do a little more of a zoomed in analysis.
So basically, under a microscope, you could tell, or you need to go into molecular tools to kind of like get a confirmation identification for that.
Yeah, so a well trained diagnostician who knows what they're looking for, who knows how to look for Lecanosticta acicula, will be able to incubate those needles and wait for the acervuli. These are the asexual fruiting structures to
Mm-hmm.
erupt from some of the dead tissues in the needle. And looking at, smashing those on a slide, looking at them under a microscope, you'll see the conidia or the asexual spores. They have a fairly distinctive kind of banana-shaped morphology overall. They're kind of a dark green to brown coloration. But again, realistically, there's a lot of fungi that are going to fruit sporulate from the dead portions of a needle.
Yeah.
So we and some of our other partners, like in the U.S. Forest Service, recommend going with a molecular method of confirmation. And there are a few really well vetted quantitative PCR and LAMP, or loop-mediated isothermal amplification assays that can help you pinpoint whether or not Lecanosticta acicula is in those samples.
Interesting. Yeah, I've seen stuff, from needle cast to also stuff like dothrostoma. They are kind of like very different, similar, sorry, in some areas. So definitely sending sample for confirmation is going to be critical. In terms of abiotic issues, right? Like we're seeing a lot of drought in a lot of states in the southeastern United States. Is that something that also could be confused with brown spot, or that's more like a different symptom?
Certainly, there's confusion. We've definitely received samples that look like they're drought stricken, or maybe they're
Mm,
beetle killed trees.
yeah.
A pine tree that's been attacked by ips, that whole crown's going to go brown kind of at the same time. And unless you're really looking for those spots and fungal fruiting, or even evidence of dead spots on an otherwise dead needle, it can be hard to parse those things out. But if you are concerned that it is brown spot needle blight or another needle disease, looking for those spots or remnants of those spots, sometimes you'll be able to see sort of darker spots along a needle that has been fully killed. And those will be a
Yeah.
clue that at some point in the death of that needle, there were fungi who were part of the killing.
Interesting. And when you look at the southeast, we have a lot of commercial plantations, right? But we also have natural forests where these tree species are fairly common. Can you talk a little bit about the impacts of this disease, both in commercial plantations but also in natural forests, right? Like what is going on with these trees that get brown spot?
Yeah, definitely. So we hear the most about this disease when it's affecting commercial plantations. These are large acreages that are worth a lot of money, and there's a lot riding on them. And so typically
Mm,
growers are pretty in tune with what's going on in their forests, and they're sending us samples as things go wrong. Now, the scale of damage in commercial forests, that's another thing we're trying to wrap our heads around. And we have some work that's starting now to try to gauge, just what brown spot infections in commercial forests mean. Now, on the
cool.
natural forest side, we had hoped that less dense populations of loblolly pine in some of these natural forests, that they would maybe be less susceptible to the disease. But what
Mm-hmm.
we've seen is that loblolly pine in national forest lands, public lands in Arkansas and Alabama and Mississippi, are hit just as hard as some of these plantations.
Mm,
Now, I don't have any
interesting.
data to say, percent losses on either side or percent growth reduction, but we see incidence of the disease, and we see a lot of damage, some cases mortality. So
Okay.
it's hitting both situations with a concerning amount of damage.
So when we were talking about mortality, is that something expected in a single year, or this is more like a cumulative effect of multiple multiple years of defoliation and an additional stressor to the life of the tree.
Definitely. So mortality is something we do see in certain cases of brown spot needle blight, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not something we expect to see after a single season. These pines are able to push out new needles the next year, and if they aren't reinfected, they're
Mm-hmm.
usually able to recover. So far as
Gotcha.
we can tell, but we're doing work now to try to understand how often reinfection occurs, how often we
Okay.
see recovery, and sort of where those tipping points are. But
Gotcha. Is that
mortality
on?
is not,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, mortality is not the main problem we see. The
Okay.
the main problems we're seeing in commercial forests are definitely the losses in growth or delayed
Mm,
rotations because of
gotcha.
subsequent years of defoliation.
So is this the studies that you're looking into, the impacts of brown spot, are those in lowly pine or looking as well in like stuff like longleaf?
These are all focused on loblolly pine. So these will
Gotcha.
be primarily commercial plantations, sites where we have access to pretty standard or lands that are planted with pretty standard methods so that we can compare different locations, try to get an idea of how the disease interacts with different sites over time.
Gotcha. And if you're in a situation, let's say like landowners or company owners or whatever, that they actually are interested in seeing this kind of thing, or if this is actually a problem in their case, when would be the best time of the year to actually assess these trees to look for symptoms or early symptoms? And we're going to be talking a little bit about management as well, but
Right.
when will be the best time to actually look for symptoms of brown spot?
So to see symptoms of brown spot, pretty much any of the as soon as things warm up after the winter, so early as February in some
Okay.
parts of the south and as late as November, you might
Mm,
see symptoms of brown spot present. We've received samples from all throughout the year when things have just started to brown up, so we know that these infections, there is likely some seasonality to them, but we can see symptoms
okay.
present all throughout the year.
Interesting. And in terms of like management, and I imagine there are different recommendations depending if you're dealing with natural forest or commercial plantation. But what are the main kind of like lines in terms of management?
So right now, unfortunately, we don't have very many tools at our disposal to
Mm,
manage brown spot on pines or really any needle disease. Now, there are a few chemical control options for nurseries.
mm-hmm.
There's chlorothalonil and mancozeb, which can be used in nurseries. And then also there's a history of using Bordeaux mixtures. So that's copper sulfate, slaked lime for control of brown spot on longleaf seedlings.
So
But
basically, it's
nothing,
always talking at the nursery level.
yes, yes. So there is nothing currently recommended or labeled for forestry use, and certainly not loblolly planted forests.
Mm. And in terms of maybe cultural methods, you were mentioning that these kind of like lower branches are the first one to show, right, symptoms of the disease. Is a valuable option to think about removing some of these branches, or not really?
I mean, there is talk of being able to prune to potentially, if those branches, if the needles on those branches are infected, it makes sense that maybe if you remove them, you might be removing some of the source of the inoculum. But we don't have any data to support that that's going
Mm,
to be enough of an activity to actually reduce overall disease severity. And besides, pruning can be an extremely expensive operation if you're talking about tens or hundreds of thousands of acres that are infected. So at this
absolutely.
point, we're working on collecting data for silvicultural recommendations, but there's just nothing quite yet.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I've seen a lot of information, kind of like you're saying, right? Kind of like thoughts or lines of thoughts that need to be further tested, but not really like backed up by research yet.
Right.
Um, I do remember for things like longleaf that the fire was something. Prescribed fire was something that was absolutely useful in terms of management. Is that something? Is that a practice that is you can look into implement for other tree species as well, or is more like a management for longleaf ecosystems?
It's certainly something that some of us in the Southeast are looking into. There's a team at Mississippi State that's
Hmm.
specifically going to look at the interaction between prescribed
Awesome.
fire and brown spot severity. Is it, as far as we understand with the ecology of this fungus, it is primarily sporulating on dead needles in the canopy, but also dead needles in the leaf litter. So it's a major
Mm.
source of inoculum within the stand. So it makes sense that
So
if we can run a fire through, we should be able to reduce that inoculum load.
so maybe then like removing those needles, if you're in a setting where it's not, like a commercial plantation, but more like an urban environment, right? Removing those needles from the ground would be maybe a valuable option in terms of like, if you don't have a plantation in terms of like a few trees and kind of like removing that inoculum would be something useful.
It could be. It could be.
Great. And what kind of like projects you guys are working in terms of brown spot? So there's a lot, of course, you were saying there's a lot of questions that we still have about the disease, particularly for lowly pine that is kind of like popping up now and it's becoming a more prevalent problem. So I imagine that you guys are working, and you already mentioned some of these projects that you guys are looking into. But what are the main kind of like research lines, the research projects that you guys are starting because of this?
So there's a number of things we're working on as a group here in Georgia. But I first want to give a shout out. We are working with a broad network of teams all throughout the Southeast U.S. This is a major effort that the U.S. Forest Service helps to sort of assemble a team of those of us here at Georgia, groups in Florida, Louisiana, Auburn, Alabama, Mississippi State, really bringing together expertise from throughout the region to tackle a regional issue. And so we're each trying to highlight our own internal expertise and then sort of leverage and supplement one another throughout the region to really try to tackle this before it costs us all a lot in terms of the ecological and economic resource we have. So,
Awesome. Yeah.
more internally, here at Georgia, we have a few lines of research going. One of the main ones right now is a collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service looking at long term or monitoring stands long term and looking at the impact of brown spot over time, the impacts of defoliation on growth and the health of the stand. We're also working with them to identify populations or families, as we call them, of loblolly pine that are potentially resistant to brown spot. This is a collaboration with the Resistance Screening Center in Asheville, North Carolina. So taking
Cool.
some of these commercially available populations that some of the Forest Service staff have noticed in the field, if we have a stand with two different genetic groups of loblolly pine, some of them are faring better than others, and all
Hmm.
other conditions are the same. Potentially, there's some evidence of genetic resistance there.
Nice. Oh, that's super interesting. I'm really looking forward to see some of these results. I think that
Thank you.
all of us that kind of work in forest health, we've been getting these questions more and more often recently in the last couple of years. So really cool to see that you guys are working, not only yourself but a big group of collaborators as well, which is really good. So of course, thanks a lot, Colton, for answering the questions and joining today to talk about round spot. Kind of like to wrap up, where people can like look at the work that you guys are doing and kind of like follow some of these projects as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Demian, thank you for having me on. Always happy to talk about this. As far as where you can find what we've been doing on brown spot needle blight, we should have our first publication on the matter of identifying what needle diseases are affecting loblolly pines here in the southeast U.S. That should be coming out pretty soon. We're also working on extension materials on these same issues, something that's a little more digestible for some of our growing partners. And also, I can be found on Twitter at Resin Soaked. You can also find the Villery Lab on Twitter as well at Lab Villery.
Great, and I'm gonna like post all the links of that you're mentioning and some other resources as well on the description of the episode. So definitely feel free to check out some of these links to get in touch with Colton as well. So Colton, thank you so much for joining. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Damian. You as well.